Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Jew Godfather here, back at it again with what may be the final episode of the Kosher Nostra podcast. Oh, also it's May and it's Jewish History Month, so gonna celebrate that. Okay, so last episode we talked about Joachim Peiper, who escaped to France, as well as French Nazi collaborators who participated in the Holocaust. Now, as well, we will be talking about and commemorating a country who hunted down Nazis after World War II. But due to its low funds and various conflicts on various fronts, it prevented it from that country from hunting down Nazis further. Also from those Nazis mostly dying in the 80s. Anyway, as always, I will have the sources in the description below, and be sure to follow my Twitter/X accounts. And if you're listening on Spotify, you can check out the YouTube version, which will have visuals you can look at, which of course you can all see that in the description below as well. Anyway, let's get into this new episode, shall we? Okay, so we are going to be talking about and commemorating Israel for its efforts in bringing Nazis to justice after World War II. This is thanks to Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad, which was established in 1949, a year after Israel's independence in 1948. The Jewish people, who hadn't returned to their homeland for 1,800 years since the Great Jewish Diaspora caused by Hadrian in 135 CE, but now the Jewish people were finally home. However, with the events of the Shoah, or the Holocaust as many people refer to it, as the Jewish population now only made up 0.2% of the 8 billion other people in the world. And even today, the Jewish population still haven't recovered to their pre-Holocaust numbers. When the Mossad was created, they would bring Nazis who were responsible for the Shoah to justice. However, not all of their operations were successful, but as efforts to still be commemorated, though. There wouldn't be very many operations to capture or assassinate Nazis after Mossad's major ones, due to lack of funding and conflicts, such as the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, as well as various terrorist attacks that endangered Israel's safety. Also in the 1980s, many Nazis would die, but however, they would put one on trial during that time. So let's get into that, shall we? Okay, so we will be talking or commemorating Israel's capture, trial, and execution of the organizer of the Shoah, Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was one of the major perpetrators of the Shoah, who was in charge with reporting on Zionist organizations and identifying who was a Jew, and the mass deportation of Jews to concentration camps across Europe, and the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, and he worked underneath Reinhard Heydrich. He was also responsible for the death marches from Budapest, Hungary, to Austria in the winter, which was a total of 120 miles in 1944. After World War II, Eichmann escaped from Europe to South America thanks to help from the Vatican, which gave him false papers. Eichmann lived under the false name Ricardo Clement. However, in 1960, he was abducted by the Mossad agents and taken to Israel to stand trial. In 1961, Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, and in 1962, Eichmann was hanged at midnight. He was then cremated, and his ashes were taken to be scattered in the sea outside of Israeli boundary waters. Okay, so now that we've talked about Adolf Eichmann, we can talk about another Nazi that Israel hunted down. So let's get to that, shall we? Okay, so we talked about Adolf Eichmann, and now we will discuss Herbert Zuckus, who was a Latvian Nazi collaborator. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, or Operation Barbarossa, Zuckus joined the Nazi forces, viewing them as liberators of Latvia, being a part of the Araj Commando, a Latvian auxiliary police unit under the command of Victor Araj. Herbert Zuckus was deputy commander of the Araj Commando, and he would snatch infants from the arms of their mothers and kill them. He also burned people alive in a synagogue and shot those who attempted to escape the blazing building with a pistol. Zuckus was responsible for the murder of 30,000 Jews, and the Araj Commando murdered about half of Latvia's Jews, nearly wiping out the entire community. His brutality got him the nicknames the Butcher of Latvia and the Hangman of Riga. After World War II, Zukas fled to Brazil, living under his real name and operating a business offering scenic flights. However, Mossad agents came after him. Mossad agent Yakov Mehdad, whose parents were murdered in the Shoah, went to Brazil under the false name Anton Kunzel, portraying himself to Zukas as a potential business partner. Mehdad would lure Zukas into a house in Uruguay where other Mossad agents were waiting, who beat Zukas once he came inside, then hit Zukas with a hammer, then shot him twice in the head. Zukas' body was then stuffed into a trunk and wasn't found until a few weeks later. Along with Zukas' body, the trunk had a note from the Mossad detailing Zukas' crimes, and then said, and I quote, "Accused was executed by those who can never forget." Zukas was 64 years old when he was executed in 1965. After the assassination, Yakov Mehdad, still using the name Anton Kunzel, along with Israeli journalist Gad Shimron, authored a book titled The Execution of the Hangman of Riga. Zukas left behind a great-granddaughter, Laura Risotto, who is a famous Latvian-Brazilian singer, who has the luxury to be alive, unlike the 30,000 Jews whom her great-grandfather murdered, many whom never had great-grandchildren. And Zukas' bloodline flows through her. All right, proceeding on. Okay, moving on from Herbert Zukas to Elias Brunner. Elias Brunner was deputy and right hand to Adolf Eichmann. He, along with 3 other Nazis, are part of a group known as Eichmann's Manor, or in English, Eichmann's Men, who helped Eichmann organize deportation of Jews. Brunner was responsible for the deportation of 128,000 Jews to death camps. He was in charge of the Drancy internment camp outside Paris, where Jews were rounded up in France before being sent to death camps. 345 of his victims were children. After World War II, in the 1950s, Brunner fled West Germany to Syria. In 1961, Mossad sent Brunner a letter bomb after being located by Israeli spy Eli Cohen. However, the letter bomb only caused Brunner to lose an eye in the explosion. So Mossad later sent another letter bomb in 1980, which exploded but only caused Brunner to lose the fingers on his left hand. He would later advise the Syrian government on torture tactics. In 2001, Brunner was found guilty in absentia thanks to Nazi hunters Serge Klarsfeld, a Shoah survivor, and his wife Beta Klarsfeld, a Nazi war crimes investigator. Brunner would later die, but some sources say he died in 2001 and some say he died in 2010. And in 2014, he was taken off the wanted Nazi list. Okay, proceeding on. Okay, moving on from Elias Brunner, who died in Damascus, Syria, we will now be talking about Jean Ivan Demanyuk, who was a Ukrainian Nazi collaborator who during World War II was a Soviet prisoner of war who was turned into a Troniki guard who was at the killing centers Sobibor and Treblinka concentration camps. He was accused of being a Troniki guard named Ivan the Terrible, because he would rush people into gas chambers, gouge out people's eyes, cut the breast of women, and stab women in the thighs and their genitals, as well as other things that I cannot say on here. In 1952, he fled to the United States and settled in Cleveland, Ohio, working for a Ford auto plant. In 1981, after investigation, Demanyuk was extradited to Israel to face trial and was the second Holocaust perpetrator to be tried in Israel. With Shoah survivors identifying Demanyuk as Ivan the Terrible, Israel sentenced Demanyuk to death. However, Demanyuk had an appeal which brought in new evidence from the former Soviet archive in 1991, which identified the Troniki guard known as Ivan the Terrible as Ivan Marchenko, not John Demanyuk. So unfortunately, due to legal reasons, they had to release the Nazi collaborator Demanyuk back to America. He was extradited again, but he lived till 2012, dying in Germany during a second trial. Okay, moving on. Okay, now from Demaniok to Hans Eisele. Hans Eisele was a Nazi doctor or physician at Buchenwald concentration camp who killed at least 200 Jews and was known as the Butcher of Buchenwald. He would perform experiments on prisoners by giving them large cuts without anesthesia and also give them lethal injections. He was captured by U.S. forces and put on trial after the war and was twice sentenced to death, but unfortunately never executed, instead just served time in prison and was then released in 1952. And after his release, he opened a medical practice in Munich, Germany. However, new allegations came up against him, and he then fled to Cairo, Egypt in 1958. Mossad was looking for Hans Eisele, and in 1963 they sent a letter bomb to Eisele, but unfortunately the bomb detonated early and killed a postal worker. In 1967, Eisele died, unfortunately never facing justice for his crimes. Now moving on. Okay, from Hans Eisele to Ulrich Schnauft. Schnauft was a Waffen-SS soldier who was captured by U.S. forces at the end of the war, but then released in 1947 when there was no evidence he committed war crimes. After the war, he decided to pretend to be a Holocaust survivor from Poland and pretended that his father was Jewish, and went to Israel in 1949 and was drafted into the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, but later discharged without commission after he was caught stealing ammo. Later, he worked for the Egyptian government spying on Israel. However, a woman he knew that discovered this told her Jewish husband, who informed the authorities in Israel, that there was a former SS member who was a spy. The Mossad wanted to kill Ulrich Schnauft, but decided to have him trialed and sentenced by law. Shmuel Morai, a Mossad agent posing as an Iraq officer, spoke with Schnauft, and Schnauft, not realizing Morai was a Mossad agent, confessed about his SS past and being an Egyptian spy. So Morai sent Schnauft to Paris, and two Mossad agents went to Schnauft, and they told Schnauft who he was and forced him to confess. Schnauft was put on trial and sentenced to prison in 1956 and released in 1961, and then deported to West Germany, where he belonged, to never return to the Holy Land Israel. Schnauft later died in 2013. Good riddance. It was humiliating that a member of the SS was in Israel, posing or pretending to be a Jew. But in the end, Israel triumphed by tricking the crowd and then kicking him out. Okay, moving on. Okay, now moving on to the final part of this discussion of Israel's efforts against Nazis is Operation Damocles. This operation was an Israeli effort to get rid of Nazi scientists who were working for Egypt in 1962 after the war. An estimated escaped 200 Nazis, many of whom worked on the V-2 rockets for the Nazi regime during World War II, were now making missiles for Egypt against Israel. The Egyptian military was also being trained by Nazis as well, or former Nazis anyway, and also producing anti-Israel propaganda for Egypt by these Nazis who worked for the regime. The reason Nazis in Egypt were working together is because there was sympathy for the Nazis, not just in Egypt, but also in other Islamic countries as well. Israel sent letter bombs, as well as other methods to kill these Nazi scientists, even threatening these Nazis. Operation Damocles, as well as diplomatic pressure, drove these Nazis out of Egypt by the end of 1963 and forced Egypt to rely on the Soviet Union for weapons. Okay, so with that, we are now going to move on to the closing. We learned about Israel's efforts against Nazis. We learned about some assassinations. some operations that were successful and some that were not as successful as others, but just worth mentioning. Anyway, I want to thank you all for listening. This was definitely the longest podcast episode that I've done, and this may be the last one for this series. Anyway, I just want to thank you all for watching and for being with me on this journey, and be sure to check out the links in the description below. Follow me on Twitter and or X, whatever you want to call it, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on Spotify. Those will all be in the description below. You can also check out my sources if you want to be more interested in that. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Sei gesund.